Emotions are the very core of what drives us. No matter what project you're working on, emotions will be experienced in many ways. This week, join me, Zach Walsh, as I talk with Thryn and Adam about their upcoming game, Ryne, a narrative tabletop role-playing game set in a world of moving titans and grand forces. We talk about working as a team, designing games, and fine-tuning your project. Welcome to Schedule for Launch, a podcast to discover projects that you may have missed. This week, I am really excited to talk about a very interesting upcoming project, and I have two wonderful creators here, Adam and Thryn. Thank you so much for joining me this week to talk about Ryne.
Hi, thanks for having us on.
Yeah, thank you.
So before we really get in any deeper and talk about this really beautiful system, can you please tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Do you want to go first, or?
You've started now, so it's
Okay,
you.
cool. Yeah, so I'm Adam Dixon. I am, I guess, a freelance game designer. I work on a whole range of different kinds of game design projects, like puzzle games for corporations, and some video games for museums and stuff like that. And then outside of that, the stuff that I really love doing is I, alongside Thryn, have a co-op who make tabletop RPGs. So yeah, we've made a few different things. We've made a bunch of mixtapes based on bangers. Jolene is probably the one that got shared the most. Yeah. And then we released our first Zine Quest game last year, which is a game called Small Town Skeletons, which is about being a teenager in a town that... What's the pitch again, Ryn?
Being a teenager in a town that is cursed, where all teenagers are skeletons, because being a teenager is simply not horrible enough.
That's it, yeah.
I remember seeing that for the first time, Small Town Skeletons, and thinking it was one of the funniest and just spot on representations of teenage life that I had seen in a long time. I absolutely adored it.
That is very flattering, thank you.
Thank you, yeah. Yeah, I think we're both from Northern England, and we wrote it to be a very accurate portrayal of our own teenage lives, and everything is that thing of if you write for yourself, sometimes it works for other people as well, which is great. And yeah, Thryn is the other half of Furtive Shambles.
Oh, yeah, hi, I'm also here. My name is Thryn Henderson. I'm a game designer as well, and a games researcher. I work a lot in kind of DIY game spaces, zine game spaces, those kind of things. And yeah, we make weird tabletop role-playing games. We make LARPs that you play in the woods. We make games about pretending to be David Attenborough that fit on business cards. We do a bunch of stuff. We have fun.
Yeah.
So before we actually hop into this game, how'd you two end up working together then?
I used to produce an event that happened in London. I did not live in London at the time, but I produced the event, which was called Video Brains, and it was kind of this monthly themed thing where game designers would come and give little talks, kind of silly little talks about ideas that we liked that month. And I think we met through that, and we both really wanted a space where we could do the same kind of thing, but for playing tabletop games. We wanted a day where you could theme around something ghosts or making a cup of tea or the ocean, and then we would pick all these weird little indie games that require quite a lot of specific setup. They need to be in a certain place, or they need really weird equipment, or they just you have to really be in the mindset to play them, a lot of the 200-word RPGs, things like that. Mm-hmm. And we wanted that very much, so we made it. And we ended up making a lot of games for the events to sort of fit in the themes, to fill in gaps that we thought were interesting, and then it was just kind of well, what if we just made games all the time? together. What if
Yeah,
we just did
yeah.
that?
I absolutely love that. That's great. Wow, I'm really happy I was able to get both of you on here then. So, yeah. So what is Ryne then?
So Ryne is like, I guess, our biggest project in a lot of ways. Like, Finn was talking about like all of the like silly games we made, and like I think we have a lot of fun in making the games that we do. Was like Ryne is like the big Powered by the Apocalypse game that we're currently working on, and Ryne is like a wild fantasy game, in which players explore this world that is shaped by these strange, weird titans that are like the husks of gods. And it's all about playing as people in a world that is like bigger than you and stranger than you, and exploring like the kinds of communities that get built and exploring the kinds of like lives that people lead within that space. If that makes sense.
No, I get that.
It is definitely our biggest project by far, but I think that came a lot from... Am I allowed to say we don't like D&D very much?
Yep, yep.
We don't like playing D&D very
Yep,
much.
100%.
But yeah, or at all, in fact. But we both really like that idea of really long form play, right? Like there are people who've had D&D campaigns that go on for like literally years. Mm-hmm. And it's wild to me that you have that, but there's no system for like how the world around you changes, or how your community changes, or how you as a person change. And I think a lot of Ryne is looking into that kind of stuff, right? It's the idea of like, if you play over a really long time, who you are fundamentally will be different at the end of that session than from the beginning. And I think a lot of the systems really feed into that.
Yeah, I think like I always picture it as a kind of like slow fantasy.
Okay.
Like, I think I've run a lot of sessions of it. And like one of the things I like about it is it like runs a lot slower than like a standard tabletop role-playing game. There's like lots of like introspectiveness, I guess, both in terms of like looking at your own characters, but also like there's lots of space to just explore the world. And I mean explore in like a couple of ways. It could be like going into a place and learning something, but it's also very like in the best ways that like a lot of indie RPGs are, like very collaborative and lots of shared world building together. And sitting down and going, okay, we're in this new area, there's a new titan here, what is that titan like? And then those titans influence the world around it, so like, what emotion or concept does that titan embody? And then you start to like build out from there. So it could be like, you have a titan that is about, preservation, for example. We played a titan called Preservation in one of our games, and that entire region then like reflects that. So like it could be that there are like Argon rivers running through that place, or like salt flats and tar pits and things like that, things that you'd associate with that kind of concept. And then when you play in that area, you're seeing like, okay, how do people live there? Like what communities get formed in a place that is largely salt flats, where there's this big weird titan who wants to just come along and pick up anything interesting and like preserve it so you can't use it anymore, or whatever. Like it's a lot of those kinds of stories, I think.
Yeah, okay, I get that. That's wonderful, actually. I really like that. Just this changing this landscape that's changing because of, you both said it right at the beginning, things that are way bigger than yourself. And I think your system really lends a lot of weight to that, because characters in this game are made up a little bit differently than other Powered by the Apocalypse systems. So things like strength, vitality, all that basic stat stuff isn't there in the same way. Do you want to talk a little bit about statistics for characters in this?
Yeah, so the main thing that like defines your character in Ryne is the emotions that you have. So when you create a new character in Ryne, you basically name like 3 important emotions for your character, like 3 things that your character feels, good or bad, that are important to them right now. Mm-hmm. And when you roll, it's like standard Powered by the Apocalypse rolling, so 2d6 and add a stat. You add one of your emotions. So when you go to make a move, the question that gets asked is, okay, how are you feeling right now? And it's kind of interesting to me, because like it kind of makes a lot of sense when I think about like how I do like day-to-day tasks or something like that. Is if I'm like, I don't know, cooking a meal, like I have a base level of skill there, but like what actually makes a difference in how well that meal gets cooked or whether I keep my cool depends on how I'm feeling that day. Like if I'm tired, I might cook something that's not as good. If I'm like in a really good space, like I'm gonna do better at that. If I'm stressed because I'm cooking a meal for a load of people and I lose my cool, like that's when that goes badly, right? So yeah, it's kind of honing in on that. And as well as those like free named emotions, you also have like emotions. You have a stat called fabric, which just is everything else. So you're never locked into those three emotions. You go with like, this is how my character feels. If it's a named emotion, you roll with that stat. If it's not, you roll with fabric, which just kind of covers everything. And then you also, we're talking about like how the territories work. You have one that's tied to the territory you're in. So like, if you're in a place of preservation, or if you're in like, I don't know, a territory around like happiness or grief or something like that, you get that emotion as a bonus because that's the thing you're playing with. Like that's something that you becomes important because you're in that space and that's what the landscape feels like. So yeah, it's kind of using emotions as stats in interesting ways.
Yeah, it most certainly does draw out a very different type of game. And I think that makes it really unique because there's not too many games where emotions or how the character feels seems to be front and center. A lot of the times it is flavor or sometimes it's a consequence. But yeah, it's true though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But putting that foot forward really pushes for a long form narrative driven game. And I'm guessing that's what drew you both to using the Powered by the Apocalypse system then.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think so. I mean, also, and this is just like a personal preference, I just really like a d6, right? Like, it's just a satisfying
Yeah.
dice. I don't like having to count too high. I like the simplicity of it. But yeah, I think, like, you mentioned, like, there are not a lot of games that kind of use emotions that way, and we did look at a couple of others really early on when we were working with the first version of what is now Ryne. And I think the thing that kind of bothered us about them was how static they are. And so a part of the reason for Powered by the Apocalypse being something that appeals to me a lot, I think, is how fluid it is in the way that you can kind of interpret your character and moves and things. But we've also built a lot into Ryne above the kind of standard Powered by the Apocalypse ideals about like shifting those emotions as you play and replacing them or locking them off or making them function differently, kind of depending on what's happened to you, just to step a little bit away from like the idea of, oh, you can feel 4 things and those 4 things are how good you are at stuff. You know, it's more like you feel a lot of stuff all the time because humans are messy and complicated, and that's probably worse when God has been cleaved in half and lives on your doorstep. And just mess around with it, you know, feel it out as you go, and that's fine. Like, it's fine to be messy with it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think we struggled for a while with, like, with having stats as emotions. How do you, like, advance or change those meaningfully? So for like a while, they sat in that standard apocalypse thing where you get an advancement, and then it's like, oh, you can add +1 to a stat. And it's like, when your stats are emotions, that feels really weird. So, like, I think in the latest versions, we've kind of shifted that into the actual play itself. So, like, as you roll, if you roll doubles, like, a thing changes in your emotion, and, like, over time, there's a thing called strain, which is, like, I might create a belief or swear an oath or, like, do something rooted in that emotion, and over time, those emotions you have shift and change. So you might start play with, like, joyful, stubborn, and careful or something like that. And then, like, 5 sessions in, you've got a different palette of emotions that you're playing with. Maybe one of those is still there, or 2 of those are still there, but maybe you've got one of them is just kind of, like, narrowed a bit. Another one, you've got a brand new emotion as well that is important to you. So it's kind of, we want it to be shifting, and we want it to kind of allow you to explore how your character is changing in the story as well.
And relating it back specifically to Powered by the Apocalypse, like, I think as a system, it's very forgiving of that kind of stuff, right? Like, the idea of there not having to be one way that you make a Powered by the Apocalypse game. It's got the spirit. So I think that was enough for us.
It's such a flexible system, and it's really easy. Like, it's not easy to hack, but it's it's definitely one of the more adaptable it's hack friendly, so
Yeah,
I definitely think it helps with that.
it's very interesting because like you asked that question of like why did we start Powered by the Apocalypse, and like another reason it started as Powered by the Apocalypse is so me, Thryn, and a few others do an actual play podcast called These Flimsy Rituals, and Ryne was originally developed for that podcast, and so as like I like GM that podcast, so like I was looking for something that felt like it would work well for a podcast, and like Powered by Apocalypse
Okay.
works really well for that, which is part of the reason why we chose that system. And it's kind of interesting because like the very first version that we played for the podcast was very much just like, let's just hack this game and this game and this game together and like cobble it together and make it work, and we'll learn what the world is like and we'll learn what this is about through play. And then like Powered by Apocalypse is very easy to hack in that way, and then you get into the development bit of it where you're like changing things like, oh wow, this suddenly gets very hard as you're like dealing with like, okay, I want this to work in a way that is going to work every time for players that aren't me.
I don't know if any of the original systems are still in the game. I think we might have binned them all off at this point.
Yeah. It's lots of like small changes, yeah.
Oh, I love that. So one of the big things too about Powered by the Apocalypse is basic moves and playbook moves. And one of the best parts from what I saw was that you've really beautifully broken down basic moves. You've expanded on them in some ways, but you've built them into social, gather, story, and confrontation. And each of these obviously can advance the story in one way or another. Can you talk a little bit about how you decided to break those down, what was important, and what kind of got thrown at the wayside because it maybe felt redundant?
Yeah. I think for a while we had basic moves, and that was like one big category. And then we had that like distinction of like then we've got bond moves, and like those are two categories. Then I realized as I was developing stuff, there was like this category of moves that was forming that felt more like story moves. So what I mean by that is like they're not things you're going to roll with all of the time, but you might roll with them like once every 10 sessions, but they're still important. So it could be stuff like it's stuff like going on a journey or like starting a project or like the seasons changing and things like that. So like we started that category there as like this is something. I think one of the hardest things when you're learning a Powered by the Apocalypse game is like, what are the moves that I need to know? What are their triggers? I need to learn all of these and like internalize all of these. So story moves is a way of going like, you probably don't need to learn all of these. Just know that they're there, and then like you can play towards them when you need them. And then like as we developed it a bit more, it just felt like we had this category of basic moves. And like you're sat there with like 10 moves in this bucket, and it's like this isn't really useful if you've not played the game before for learning stuff. So I think like going into like social and gather and confrontation, I think those are the categories. There might be another one, risky as well. Yeah. Was basically I just wanted to give a tool for players to be like, okay, I'm in this situation, I'm talking to someone. Okay, these are social moves. I can just look at those, and these three moves are going to be what's most likely to be triggered here. Or like I'm in a fight, or like I'm climbing a mountain or overcoming like an obstacle in the wilderness, like I'm probably going to look at the risky moves. So I just wanted like a way of just signaling to players where they should be looking as they're looking for move triggers.
To an extent as well, like the category of basic moves was functionally useless because of the way we've set rulebooks up, in that they're not necessarily divided by any kind of like profession or particular skill. Like a couple of the magic based ones are specifically about the ways you interact with magic personally. But a lot of them are kind of just the social aspect of your character, right? It's the way you connect with other people. So a lot of the idea of like basic moves was really weird because they weren't just like, oh, these are the things everyone can do, because some of that is parceled out into rulebooks and you do it in specific ways depending on who you are. So it was more useful to break it down into specific categories and say, okay, well, I guess there's a bunch of stuff that everyone can do socially. There's a bunch of stuff that everyone can do confrontationally. And if you want to do those, that's where you find them.
So it's like a sorting tool then.
Basically. And
Yeah.
I think one of the things that, like, we make clear in the book as well is like it's a sorting tool, but like they're not hard categories. Like we talk about social moves, but like if you've got the move, one of the moves is like convince, like you're talking to someone, you're trying to convince them of something. Like that doesn't just have to be social. You could be convincing someone by like, I don't know, like
physically
maybe you're
threatening them.
yeah, like it could be a physical threat. It could be like duping them or something like that. It doesn't necessarily always have to come up in that situation. But I think it's about like developing degrees of mastery in the game. I think because I think that's
Yeah.
what learning a game is, right? Like, and I think for newer players, it's good to have those categories where it's like, okay, I just need to know roughly blah blah blah. I don't need to remember all of these triggers. I can just remember there are risky moves. Okay, I'm doing something, this feels risky, how does this fit, or whatever. And just allowing players to fold into that. I think you ask about, like, whether we've discarded moves, and all of the time.
So many. We could build a second book from the moves we've discarded.
I feel like every time I go into basic moves, sometimes it's because something's triggered in me, and I'm like, oh, we need a move to do this. And like every time I'm like, I can only add another move in if I get rid of 2 other basic moves. Like, so I just get to the point where it feels a bit long. And like, so it constantly goes from like this list of like 15 moves to a list of 10 and it's just like fluctuating between those.
Some of them just kind of got conflated together. Some of them were like, you don't need 2 separate moves to do this basic thing, right? It's the same idea with different flavour. Let's make it one move. Some of them got moved to role books because we were like, well, can everyone do that? Maybe that's a specific thing. And then some of them, just did get binned. It's like, well, we've got too many. This isn't basic anymore.
Yeah, like we had a general protect move as one of the like bond moves you could do. And it was like, this is sort of nice, but like the game's not really the game's like quite a low violence game and there's not a lot of fighting in it. Like when we did the podcast, there's maybe 1 episode out of 30 where we had any kind of like physical confrontation. Oh, wow. And yeah, it was like, well, actually, it feels like this could just go into a role book called The Guardian, which is all about being like a fighter who has like a child in their care, and it like explores like how do you balance those things? How do you like balance the violence of your past with like taking care of someone and stuff like that? So it felt like, oh, actually, it feels like that role book because so many of their moves kind of lead into the protect move. Like, why don't we just make that their defining move? And it just felt so much stronger already as like, this is the thing you can do. You can like take harm and consequences for other people. Felt like a much bigger statement to be in that space.
That feels really appropriate. Yeah, I can understand that. We've actually been talking a lot about role books and in other Powered by the Apocalypse systems, they might be called playbooks, but we really haven't defined what they are. So for those of you listening, a playbook or a rule book is kind of like a class or what defines what your characters can and can't do compared to another character. And the ones that I've seen, I really like. Mm-hmm. Can you give me a brief description on the 4 or 5 that you have?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember what's in
now
this
we have to
version
remember
of it,
which ones are in the play kit.
Oh no.
The guide,
yeah,
the heart, and then 2 others.
The Tethered and the Weaver. Yeah, so in the play kit is the Heart, who is like a mix between like a storyteller and a priest or like a radical. There's someone who like represents a concept in the world. And it's kind of just exploring like, what does that mean to represent that? Do you keep faith with that concept or the institution that represents it? The Guide is all about going into landscapes and knowing them like better than anyone else, so you get like some home territories that are yours and that you know. And it's kind of like one of the things I want to do with that is like not make it too rangery. Like it's not about going to it can be about going to places and exploring them, but it can also be about like, I am someone who like goes trading between different markets in this area. I know all the paths and like the animals, and I know what that means if like a bird sings that. Like, so you can go either way with that, about being really knowledgeable or like really explorative. The Weaver is someone who does like a kind of magic. They're kind of like a witchy character. We've not really spoken about it, but the way a lot of the magic works in Ryne is that humans have both like a body and a spirit. And if you imagine like that spirit is a big web of threads like connecting the world, like made out of like concept and emotion. that's what the Weaver plays with. Like, so they tie those into patterns to cast like small spells and magics. And then the Tethered is a ghost. So they are. You can play most. Yeah. You can play most of the rollbooks as a ghost, which is why it's not called the Ghost rollbook. So like you could play a Weaver as a ghost, you could play a Guide as a ghost, you could play whatever the first one was as a ghost, the Heart. But the Tethered is like a ghost who feels very comfortable being a ghost. Like you've either been born a ghost or you've become a ghost, and you're like, this suits me, this is good. I can do weird stuff with my form now, and yeah, I can kind of push that in interesting ways.
Yeah, we've got it set up so that by default you play as a human with a spirit and a body, but for any rulebook you can say, well, actually I'm pure spirit, I'm just tethered, or I'm pure body, I'm grounded, I think is the term we're using for that at the minute. But then there are rulebooks for each of those things specifically for when you're like, that's not just like an incidental fact about me, that's the core of who I am.
Yeah. I think Powered by the Apocalypse does this quite a lot anyway, is like, rollbooks are sort of like classes, but they also have like a bit of a story encoded in them. And it's not necessarily like, if I play this rollbook, I will play this exact story. It's like, I will play this sort of character. So like, if you're playing the Heart, who is like about representing a concept, you're probably going to have an organization that represents that. So you might play out the idea of like, okay, I'm going to keep faith in this thing, but do I keep faith with like the organization that represents that, whether that's a church or whether that's a revolution or something else? So yeah, it kind of has those stories written into them.
And you could also play the Heart as just kind of really strongly representing community values, right? Like if you don't want to go through a formalized institution, you're still a Heart if you're someone who, you know, remembers orally the traditions of the place that you live in and upholds them day to day. So it's really about like the kind of person you are rather than the profession you have or the skill that you have. But then that's a bit muddy waters when it comes to magic, because that is also a skill that you have. But
yeah, but then I think that's why we have about 2 or 3 different rulebooks planned who do like specific magic stuff. Like anyone can do some kind of magic if you try. Like there's a move to see whether you can do that, but like yeah, for like if you want to be like, I can do magic, there's like a few different rulebooks that tell different stories with that. Like the Weaver is all about kind of being connected to community and people and that. And then there's like a rulebook, which I think someone played on the podcast actually, called The Unraveling, which is like, I can do very big destructive spells. If you imagine the Weaver is like sewing patterns and magic together, The Unraveling is like pulling bits of thread and just doing what they can to like cast spells. And that's a story of like, okay, this is having a destructive impact on me. So like The Unraveling is all about exploring that kind of journey of I'm more powerful, but also there's going to be a consequence over time. So you can see how there's different
self-destructive
like,
rulebook for people who enjoy that kind of thing.
Boy. Yeah, that's so. Speaking of self-destruction, one thing I wanted to talk about is threats, and specifically the wear down of characters, because that is very different than a lot of systems. So would you mind talking a little bit about wear and character harm?
Do you know how I said earlier, like, the basic moves are the thing that we've touched the most and edited the most? I think also, like,
we lied.
Yeah, it's how you wear. So, we've had, like, so many different versions of this, but essentially, because the world is both physical and spirit-based, we wanted, like, a kind of harm that would reflect both of those, right? Like, we wanted to be able to be like, okay, I've got a wound, that means something, or like, oh, my spirit's fraying at the edges, and like that means something as well. We wanted those to have like equal narrative consequence. And I can't remember what was the early system like, Thryn? Was it?
The early system, I think, was wounds and wear. So
Yeah.
it was it was a 3-part track, and you could take 3 physical injuries and 3 spirit injuries. It was just so binary, and it didn't like, your body and your spirit are so intertwined in a lot of cases that splitting them straight down the middle didn't make sense. And it also didn't leave a lot of room for like things that wear you down socially or communally. but that hadn't physically sort of punched you in the face.
Yeah.
And so much of the game is about that aspect of existing as a human being that it was like, well, I don't think this is adequate anymore.
Yeah, and even like there's like a lot of focus on like journeying and like moving through landscapes in Ryne as well, and it's like, how do you represent exhaustion? Because like
how do you
calling
just
that harm doesn't
be
feel
really
right.
tired?
Yeah. And I think when we did the podcast, there was like a great moment where Thryn's character, who was a heart called Belka, got really injured, and like in the system it was like, I have got 2 harm out of 4, and like that's all there was there. And like Thryn played it really well, where they were walking around like role-playing that injury, like as people do in like those sorts of games. And I was just sat there like, we've got to do better than this. Like, I think a lot of like the design of Ryne is like, how do we give players enough tools to like role-playing it in interesting ways, or how do we give them stuff that is like interesting and evocative but not prescriptive? So like the way Where works now is when you take Where, you mark it against something on your sheet. So it could be that you mark your Where against one of your emotions or one of your moves, or say if you've got a companion with you, maybe it like affects them instead. And you kind of give like, you create your own condition around that, and you give a description, and it has like some ongoing mechanical effects, but you get to decide what that is.
You don't really track kind of the level of harm that you have anymore. You keep track of the consequences you are living with, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so it could be like, if you marked, let's say you marked a move, that's like the most basic one. Like, depending on how heavy that is, that could give you disadvantage, that could stop you using that, or that could like remove it entirely as like a permanent effect. Like, you probably won't hit that, but like it's a possibility. And the player taking that gets to say, depending on the fiction, like what that represents. It could be like, I took a really heavy hit, so therefore I can't use this fighting move anymore. Like, I get disadvantage using it because like my arm hurts and I can't swing a sword as well. Or it could be like, I am, one of the rulebooks is like a tendo, is someone who has like a piece of land or a farm or something like that. And it could be like, I've taken some Where and I'm going to mark one of my moves, but my move is something related to that farm. And it could be like, oh, actually, stuff on my land got damaged during a storm. Or like, I'm very tired and not able to like look after my land as well. So like, Where can represent that as well. So it's all like, what I wanted to give emphasis to is like, there are multiple ways of taking it, and the player gets to like decide what that means and like how they want to roleplay that.
Really enjoying it as a new system. And I think like it worked well for us in 2 different ways, because like as Adam said, there were moments where we were role-playing something that had hit really hard, and we were describing how it would impact our emotions and our moves and the way that we could conduct ourselves in the game, but then on the sheet it was just like 2 points of harm. But in the other way, there are moments where like you really feel like something should have hurt you more than it did, right? And I know not everyone role plays that way, but I think for a lot of people there's a genuine like enjoyment of that dramatic moment of like, oh yeah, you say that this grazes me, but actually, no, this has created a huge wound, or, you know, I'll never recover emotionally from this, or I'm burning this friendship bridge right here, right now. I'm throwing down my gauntlet. And like being able to choose that for yourself, I think is really powerful, because it's almost disappointing to have psyched yourself up for this really dramatic moment of Where, and then like you roll a particular way and it goes, oh well, actually that's just 1 point. You're like, no, I deserve more than this.
Yeah, I think there's like lots of space that we try to put in the game. Like Where is one example, and then so you have like strain conditions for emotion, which are like, as I said, like you might swear a belief when an emotion gets particularly high or whatever, or like take an oath or something. And then also like bonds are a system that also works in a similar way. And like, I think it's just that thing of like giving those players the tools that they want to kind of do exciting things with that. Like my favorite bit as like a player and a GM is like when a player kind of just inflicts fun consequences on themselves and just, yeah.
Yes.
And is able to play that up, and it's just like, here you go, here are some tools that are going to allow you to do that. They're not going to tell you exactly how things work. Like it's not like, I'm thinking about like games where you might get like a sanity condition or a particular condition where it's like, you have to roleplay like this. It's like, it's never that. Like, it's like, how do you want to treat this situation? If you strain in let's say, trusting, does that mean that do you want to play that so you are like overly trusting of someone? Do you want to play that so like your trusting breaks? Do you want to play that so like you make a really, really like stupid promise to someone? And so like there's lots of different spaces for players to like grab a thing and make it their own.
It's such a weird practical little niggle as well, but actually like swapping from having wounds and wear, where wear was the spirit-based harm, and into this new kind of wear system helped us distance a little bit from the kind of tabletop RPG scene implication of anything that's linked to your emotions and your spirit being like your mental health, and being able to just step back from that and be like, no, that's not true. Your spirit is just a thing that's in you, like your body is just a thing that's around you.
Yeah. Like, we talk a lot about you having like a body and a spirit, but it's also like, you still have a mind. Like, we just don't touch that because like that's not what this game is about. And I think it's hard for a game to be about that anyway. Like, that's what you're doing.
I love it. I love it so much. You've painted this to me what I'm always envisioning when I'm looking at this, or when I've mentioned this to a couple people interested in these style of games, and to me it reminds me of like a like this wonderfully painted Miyazaki film, but it's just the tools to make that with you and your friends, and I think that is so much fun.
That is a huge compliment.
Yeah, Miyazaki films are like a big influence on the world. Like we name our influences a lot, and like Miyazaki is obviously one, and then just like Earthsea and like Banner Saga and Shadow of Colossus and stuff like that. So like if you're imagining those sorts of worlds, like you're on the right track of like what this game is.
Beautiful. All right, so we've actually been going for almost 40 minutes here, so we're starting to run out of time. How something that I always find that's really important right now is current world situation with COVID-19, and listeners of the podcast will know that this is a question that comes up pretty often. But how did the pandemic affect the development of Ryne?
The development, on a practical side, not so much, because we live in the same house. So that was very convenient.
Oh, that's convenient.
Yeah. In terms of stretching out the timeline, it impacted it enormously, because obviously the mental toll of the last year and a half has been pretty intense. And working on a game all about kind of struggling under a huge unknowable landscape, incomprehensible to you, that you cannot see a way out of, was like,
Luckily, there's a lot of beauty in the game as well.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Like, yeah.
Sorry, that got me.
Yeah.
It's like a weird dark mirror.
Yeah, but we made it through. In some ways, maybe it was good. It gave us a lot of time to really sit with the ideas. Mm-hmm. I think it slowed us down a little bit, but it slowed everyone down, right? So
yeah,
the big challenge for me has been like particularly in playtesting the game.
Yes,
'cause, like,
that's been really difficult.
Yeah, like we obviously, when we do the podcast, we play online because we're all scattered throughout the UK, and like so like we're used to online play for that, and like that was kind of fine. But like when we're playtesting systems, it just got really hard. Like especially because like games shift and change a lot as like you're playtesting them and you're bringing new ideas. And one of the things that I found hard was, it's really hard to find a good virtual tabletop that will allow you to like easily create rollbooks and stuff. Like we tried at least half a dozen different ways to do that, from like Google Sheets to Roll20 to Bari to Miro and all of those things. And like the other thing was, it's really hard to know where some of the issues are having. Like, I think one of the issues with Ryne is for a Powered by the Apocalypse game, it has a few like interlocking systems that are like not complex, but like take a little bit of time to get your head around it. I'd explain it as being a bit like a Blades in the Dark style system, where it's like, oh, you have something like stress in Blades in the Dark, where when that fills up, this happens, and like things trigger in those kind of like consecutive ways. it was very hard to work out if someone was having a problem with how a system worked, whether that was an issue in me explaining it, an issue with the system, or an issue with like someone not being able to work out how like a spreadsheet version of the character sheet worked. So it's just incredibly frustrating all the time to be like, oh, what is going wrong here? And like diagnosing that is kind of hard. And also you have that issue of like, if you're talking to someone online, it's so much harder to get a read on how they're feeling in that moment, or like what's going on in their head. There's no body language, right? So yeah, that became a fun challenge.
Anything to add on to that, Thryn?
No, I think the playtesting was definitely the big one. And even just like the ability to organize playtesting. People are so burnt out doing things online that you're like, hey, do you want to come and do our 4-hour playtest on a Saturday afternoon? Everyone's like, no, no, thank you. If I could come to your house and like eat a sandwich, yeah, that would be great. But online, nah, no.
And I think we're both like physical game designers primarily. Like we do some digital stuff, but like I think both of our instincts are like, if we're making a role-playing game, like what is that going to be like at the table? So like the current version of the character sheets and like my dream character sheets for Ryne are when you take moves and stuff, instead of it just being on a sheet and that being 4 pages long, like it's a two-sided thing, and like you stick stuff on, like you cut out moves and you stick them on and make your own like little collage sheet. And like,
oh, that'd be so cool.
Yeah, and like stuff like eventually maybe like that's the thing you can do, stickers or something like that, and trying to like replicate that online is hard. Or like trying to do stuff of like this thing is next to this thing on the sheet because that indicates like a connection is hard to do. And
but then we would have had to figure all of that out eventually anyway, because we want people to be able to play the game online, right? So it shoved it further closer to us on the timeline than we wanted, but we wouldn't have escaped it. So
yeah.
All right, so final question, and this is a really important one to me because a lot of people who come in and listen to this podcast are either looking for new things that they can look into and play, or they're trying to develop something of their own. And this is a question for them. So you two have a fair bit of experience developing games and various ways to interact and do these storytelling modules, I'd like to say. What advice can you give somebody who has no experience and they are looking to start?
Make a zine. That's my find one idea that you are enamored with and you enjoy and dedicate 6 pages to it in whatever form that you want. And the act of making it physically, I think, translates playfully a lot of ways in the way that we think about ideas. And I think it's a really good bouncing off point for what about this is interesting to me? What about this do I want to interact with? What's a fun way to present this for other people? And then also stop caring about other people and make things that you like.
Yeah, my advice is largely the same of most of my design work, whether it's a role-playing game or a video game, always starts on paper because it's just so much easier and you can do stuff in a really scrappy and messy way. And you can just
if you don't like it, you can physically scrunch it up. Yeah, throw it away.
Yeah, it's way more fun than deleting. And I think for role-playing games or anything actually, start small. You might have a really big idea for your grand game that you want to make. This is sort of my grand game that I wanted to make. But I did a project when I first started out designing where I just made a game that was really small and really scrappy every week for a year. And I would not recommend doing that. That was hell. But
yeah, don't do that.
Just make lots of small games. Just make stuff that is a few pages or it's just a really rough version of the game, and then just put it in front of people, play it, and most of your design work will happen through play anyway, as you put it in front of people and go what do you think? Or as Thryn says, keep it secret to yourself and make the game that you secretly really, really want. Think about why you're designing it and who it's for, and you don't necessarily have to care about other people. If you just want to make a nice solo RPG for yourself, do it.
Yeah, be wildly self-indulgent. That's my advice.
Yes. Yeah.
Both phenomenal advice. It's been a lot of fun. Thryn, Adam, where can people find you?
The central hub, I guess, would be furtiveshambles.com, which is our website where you can sign up for our mailing list. It's got our Discord and Twitter links on it. It's got the not quite current version of the Play Kit in, but that will be coming very soon, so it might be available by the time this podcast goes out. But there's a version, either way, of the Play Kit on there that you can download and play, and then fill in a form to tell us about what you liked.
And yeah, like if you're interested in the game, like there is a mailing list on there and there's a Twitter that you can follow. We're hoping to have a version that we're going to kickstart sometime this year. So if you want to either help like playtest to get us there, or like if you're interested in maybe checking out the game once it's on Kickstarter, we've got like some really nice art planned for it. We've got some really good like we got. Should we talk? Are we allowed to talk about the map?
I think we can talk about the map.
Yeah, we've got some really nice, hopefully, things planned that we can print and afford to print, of like a nice fabric map to go with the book, that you can use as like both a book wrap and like use as the map of your world and like lay it on your table as like your play space. So we've got stuff like that planned. So yeah, if you're interested in the game, you can go and sign up to the mailing list or follow us on Twitter and you'll get updates about it. If you want to like hear the game played, even if it's like a very early version, it still has like a very strong sense of like what the world is and what play is like. You can go to flimsyrituals.com or go to These Flimsy Rituals on Twitter. No, I think it's just Flimsy Rituals on Twitter.
It's just Flimsy Rituals on Twitter.
Yeah, and that's like our actual play podcast, and you can like listen to the show and get a sense of like what the game is like through that as well.
As always, listeners, these things will be linked down below this podcast, so you can click there and go directly to where you can find these really cool projects. I'll let you know that from what I've been fortunate enough to see, this is shaping up to be super beautiful. The color palette blows my mind. There's something about it, and I love it so much. But Adam, Thryn, thank you so much for joining me, especially so last minute.
No, thank you for having us.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, I look forward to seeing more from Ryne, everybody. So, Thryn, Adam, and Ryne, they're all scheduled to launch very soon. Have a good night. Take care of yourselves. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much to both Adam and Thryn for coming onto the show this week. Ryne is looking for gameplay testers still, and if their podcast is anything to judge by, it'll certainly be worth your time and a lot of fun to join them for that. So you can check the descriptions down below to find out where you can join in on that. As always, thank you, listener. Because of you, I've had to do some shifts for some things. I know last week I said that we'd be going back to a bi-weekly format, but just with the heavy amount of traffic and a lot of people coming in and asking to come onto the show, we're going to be going back to the weekly format as we've been doing for the past month or so. So remember to tell your friends so that I can keep doing this. If you want to hear more from me, you can find me on Tuesday nights at the Veil of the Void stream for a narrative actual play of the game. It's been really fun, and you can look forward to the podcast format and music coming out shortly. I made a lot of the music for that stream, and it's just been a sweet project to work on. Next week, we're going to be talking with Weston, so those longtime listeners who've kind of been on schedule for launch for a while will recognize that name, and I am super excited to talk to them. So I hope to see you there. Take care. Have a good night. Bye.